welcome Executive Vice President of Atlantic Live, Candace Montgomery.
What a room. You all look fantastic. Welcome. As you heard, I'm Candace Montgomery, Executive Vice President of Atlantic Live, head of all the events and experiences in real life and on screens across the country. I want to see a show of hands for all the subscribers in the room. Wow. No, but thank you all for your support of the Atlantic's journalism. And welcome, and thank you for joining us today for our On the Future and Atlantic Festival event. Today will be an afternoon of rigorous discourse, exploring how recent shifts in politics and policies are reshaping domestic and international societal dynamics. We've convened influential leaders across industries, policy, finance, defense, tech, health, and climate to understand the future of America and its place in an ever more complex world. Before we get started, I want to thank our underwriters, Elastic and Ogilvy, for their support of the Atlantic's journalism today. We welcome you to share your experience on social media by using the hashtags OnTheFuture and TAF25. You can also support our journalism by subscribing to The Atlantic by visiting theatlantic.com/subscribe. Now, let's get started.
For a special presentation of Washington Week Live with The Atlantic, please welcome Atlantic staff writers Tim Alberta, Ashley Parker, Ann Applebaum, and Tom Nichols, with Atlantic Editor-in-Chief Jeffrey Goldberg.
Hey, Dad! What have you got?
Hi, good afternoon. It's a very narrow stage. This is kind of a test of our balance. Did you notice that? It's like incredible. Oh yeah, the audience will catch us. That's very nice, very supportive. There's some people who work in the White House who would like us to fall right off this stage, I think. This is supposed to be like this is very serious. I'm sorry. Good afternoon. I'm Jeff Goldberg. I'm the editor-in-chief of The Atlantic. And the moderator of Washington Week. We're doing a fake Washington Week, except that it's also real because apparently it's going to be on TV or YouTube or something. Anyway, welcome to Washington Week. Thank you for coming. You know who all my esteemed colleagues are. And I just thought we would jump into it, if it's okay. We're 100 days down in the Trump administration. There's 1,361 to go. Every 100 days, we're going to have a check-in right here. There'll be sandwiches. You guys just come back every 100 days for the next 4 years, and we'll just, we'll have to be paying you to do that at a certain point. But as some of you know, Ashley and I and Michael Shearer, our colleague, had an interesting and illuminating and fascinating encounter with the president last Thursday in the Oval Office. And I thought before we started talking about all of the many things that have happened over the last 100 days, I would ask Ashley to give you all a little bit of a insider-y feeling for how that all came about and why we're now best friends with Donald Trump. Until he calls me a scumbag on social media, which is...
It feels like you're due.
I'm overdue for one, before the next 100-day meetup. Anyway, Ashley, wouldn't you give a little bit of a sense of what we were trying to do and the cover story that I think you've all seen is now out, posted on the Atlantic.com?
Sure. So before we got the interview in the Oval Office, there were two pretty cruel or like attacking Truth Social posts and one late night presidential pocket dial. And the way this all happened was I started The Atlantic with my colleague Michael Shearer. We'd both recently come from the Washington Post. And pretty early on, Jeff assigned us The Atlantic never promises covers, so it was a cover length story, trying to tell the story of Donald Trump's remarkable political comeback and the lessons he learned during those 4 years in the wilderness that are informing how he is wielding the levers of power now, which is a lot more aggressive, brash, creative, willing to shatter through democratic norms. So we go through the normal procedure. Jeff helps us. We write sort of a pitch letter to the White House, why we think the president should talk to us. We give it to them. To our surprise, he says, yes, he'd love to sit down with us. And the week the interview is put on his schedule, I mean, we really believe it's going to happen. I was supposed to visit my younger sister in Mexico City. I canceled the trip because I have a presidential interview. And it is on. And then that Monday, I get a call from the White House and an aide says, we have bad news. The interview is off. And I say, what? Why? And he goes, well, the president's going to share that on Truth Social. And I'm like, what? And they say, yeah, so basically, long story short, as the interview got known to a wider circle of the president's orbit, someone who didn't want it to happen with The Atlantic went in, showed them things I had said on television and that I had written in stories that the president didn't like. And so he decides to call off the interview. So he does it, dramatic fashion on Truth Social. The interview's off.
He calls you names.
Yeah, he calls us names. He calls me and Michael names. Interview's off. So then we.
By the way, one of his, just so you understand, one of his criticisms of Ashley was that she argues that he lost in 2020. And that was one of her main sins.
Yes, devastating black mark against me. So interview.
First time anyone has argued that.
So he calls off the interview, and we get the president's personal cell phone number. Michael calls him one morning on a Saturday, 10:45 a.m. President doesn't know Michael's number, but he just picks up and starts chatting. And Michael does a very good interview for 20 minutes with President Trump. Afterwards, we go to the White House and we say, called the president, he picked up, we interviewed him, and one of the senior advisors says
And no one on his team knew that Michael was talking to him as he was talking?
Not in advance. We were told later that someone had walked in while they were chatting and then started messaging people on the team to alert them. But so we say to the White House, we did an interview with the president, a very senior aide says, I don't love that. So we finished the story. We don't think he's going to participate. In the meantime, Signalgate happens, and sort of at the very last minute, after the story has literally closed, we get a call from the...
Closed meaning we had finished editing art. It had been literally shipped to the printer. I mean, it literally out the door.
Yeah, it felt stressful. So we get this call, would you and Michael like to come to the White House tomorrow to interview the president? And then the president's aide texts, oh, and by the way, the president says, Jeff should join if he likes. And that is how we found ourselves in the Oval. And also we were promised 20 minutes, and then we ended up showing up at the Oval Office and getting an hour with President Trump.
All right, and you could read their amazing story in theatlantic.com, and we've also posted pretty substantial excerpts from the conversation, which was indeed fascinating. And I want to ask a couple of questions about that. And maybe let me start with Tom. You read it. You've been writing about him for years. What struck you in about their story, about their conclusions, and really about what he said to us, not only about Ukraine, but about the sort of the whole waterfront?
Yeah, I mean, the thing.
And don't use any curse words, because this is PBS.
The thing that I thought was so striking is that he wanted to talk to you at all, because he felt like somehow you had bested him in some way, that this earlier story, that you were now almost kind of on his level after the whole Signalgate business, and now he had to talk to you, and that he wants to think of himself, and this really comes through in the story, as consequential and a mover and a shaker. And it doesn't matter what direction he moves anything in, bad or good. Just ask the conservatives in Canada. Amazingly, he's bragging about, look how I took a runaway race and I made it that tight for our guys. And I think that was just something that was really interesting to me, because it showed once again that he doesn't really have a political North Star that isn't him.
Yeah. And let me ask you this, because we did talk about Ukraine a lot. One of the questions I asked him had to do with his lack of sympathy, apparent sympathy for Ukraine as a cause. He has, many of you know this, he's redecorated the Oval Office, and there's a big portrait of Ronald Reagan right in pride of place, I would say, the most prominent place. And so I said, Ronald Reagan, and this has been bipartisan for 100 years, American presidents have innately sympathized with the small nations and the small peoples that have been historically oppressed by Russia, Soviet Union and then Russia again. You're the first one I can think of who doesn't have that innate sympathy. Why? And I want to ask, Anne is obviously the world's leading expert on Soviet oppression and Russian imperial behavior. I wanted to ask you what you make of Donald Trump as an unusual type in the White House.
I mean, surely the answer is that he doesn't really sympathize with anybody. I mean, he doesn't have, he doesn't have any, he doesn't have a kind of morality about his politics where he thinks about, even in the kind of Hollywood good guys and bad guys. Doing politics isn't about trying to create a positive solution or make Europe safe. Or, I know for a fact, I know that people tried to explain this to him in the last administration. People kept explaining to him that if Russia is allowed to overrun Ukraine, or if Russia is allowed to, or if China is allowed to overrun Taiwan, that will have consequences in other places, because then other strong men in other countries will also feel that they can break these rules. And there's a big international system, and it has certain rules, written and unwritten, and you're not supposed to break them. And people would say this to him over and over and over again, and he just couldn't understand it. He didn't care. His goal in any foreign policy initiative is, am I winning? Can I beat Jeff Goldberg? I lost one round to him in Signalgate, but can I get back at him in the interview? Am I personally looking good? Am I the victor of this conversation? And maybe also in the case of Ukraine and Russia, how much money can people around me make out of it? Are people going to make money from doing business with Russia again? There are all kinds of rumors that I can't stand up about what's at stake in that negotiation. But none of the strategic questions that we think are important, or that Reagan thought were important, or that Bill Clinton thought were important, or really that any American president have thought were important for the last several decades, they just don't interest him. I mean, I think you're right. Everything is about...
They don't interest him, or he doesn't know, and I don't mean this in a snarky way, he doesn't know that they exist.
But I think it amounts to the same thing. I mean, they are part of a world he doesn't care about. He doesn't think strategically at all. I mean, I remember this. I was in Denmark earlier this year. I was in Copenhagen, and it was the day after Trump had a horrible phone call with the Prime Minister of Denmark, and it was a very amusing moment. I got there. I had all these appointments. I was actually supposed to see the Prime Minister. I was supposed to see the Foreign Minister, and one by one, everybody canceled on me, and there was kind of hysteria in Copenhagen because of this phone call. And there was one point I was standing on a bridge, walking back and forth, trying to figure out, was I going to this Parliament or the Foreign Ministry, because they kept changing the time. Anyway, but what really upset the Danes, who are they're a logical people, and they're part of all these important multilateral institutions. They're the EU and NATO and so on. What upset them was that Trump didn't have any goal that they could understand when he was talking about Greenland. Everything, and they kept saying everything he wants to do. He wants to drill for minerals there. Please, go drill. There are companies here drilling. You can do it right now. You want shipping lanes? Go have access to shipping lanes. We'll give you that. He wants a military base. There's one already. You can have more. You used to have more. There were some bigger ones in the past. One point, the U.S. even kept nuclear weapons in Greenland. So there was nothing that he could explain that made sense to them. Other than, the only thing they could work out is Greenland looks very large on a map, especially the Mercator projection. And he just wanted to have it be part of the United States. And they didn't get it. And it created this political crisis in Denmark as they were trying to understand what this meant. And I feel like that keeps repeating itself over and over again with tariffs. What's the point of tariffs? Is it about bringing back manufacturing? Is it about fighting China? Is it about doing deals? All those things are contradictory. I mean, and I'm not sure there is a tariff strategy. It was just Trump wanted to break stuff and see what happened, and then, try and win, keep winning the arguments.
I want to come back to the sort of with Ashley and others, the question of what actually motivates him or how he understands the world. But I want to ask Tim about the Republican Party. You're one of the foremost chroniclers of the fairly radical changes that have taken place in Republicanism over the past decade. And as I'm sitting there with Ashley and Michael in the Oval Office, I'm thinking and listening to Donald Trump not endorse the cause of Ukraine. I'm thinking about someone many of us knew very well, John McCain, who was just a little bit more than a decade ago the standard bearer of the Republican Party, right? McCainism is the opposite of Trumpism, especially when it comes to understanding America's exceptional role in the world. How do you, walk us through this a little bit. How do you explain the 100% change in the way the Republicans think about America and its role in the world?
Jeff, to answer that question, and I'll try to be as succinct as I possibly can be because there's a lot of ground to cover, but I think we have to recognize that the roots of this go back so much farther, so much deeper than Donald Trump. In a book that I had written 6-7 years ago, I was recounting this scene that during George W. Bush's presidency, where he's sitting down with a couple of his advisors after the midterm election, after the 2006 midterm election, and he had already seen after his own reelection in 2004 a couple of his big signature initiatives that the White House had really poured capital into, Social Security reform and immigration reform, basically die on the vine. And the intensity, the ferocity of the pushback that he was seeing and that his advisors were seeing from the Republican base during this time, we're talking, 07-ish, was really alarming to them. And they were seeing that the Republican base was changing kind of right in front of their eyes. And Bush said to a couple of his advisors, he said, there are these isms, this nativism, this protectionism, this isolationism. And Bush turned to Karl Rove and he said, these isms are going to eat us alive, us meaning the Republican Party. And boy, what a prescient scene to think about how, we mentioned John McCain. Just a year later, with McCain putting Sarah Palin on the ticket and the sort of, the kind of proud, not just populism, but let's be candid about it, sort of an anti-intellectualism that she represented, a backlash against the elites, against the universities, against the moneyed, against the well-educated, all of these things. And then you start to see this snowball into the Tea Party era at the beginning of the Obama presidency, with Palin representing sort of a kingmaker in the Republican Party. And suddenly, there was sort of a choice that was becoming apparent for more and more of the Republican Party's leadership, more and more of the conservative movement's leadership, which was, you can either jump on this populist runaway train or you can become irrelevant. And what we began to see was that more and more of the folks, the McCains, the Romneys of the world, who tried to take a principled stand and at least slow this march of sort of populist demagoguery inside the Republican Party, they were more and more marginalized. And the people who sort of threw in with it, whether it be Ted Cruz, whether it be Jim DeMint, some of these folks, Mark Meadows, who really, in many cases, went from being nobodies. Mark Meadows went from being a backbench freshman Republican lawmaker from the mountains of Western Carolina to being White House chief of staff in the matter of a few years, right? That's unheard of. And what's the common denominator for most of these folks? They knew in private that this was a dead end for the party. They understood that whatever short-term political gains were that they might have, and there were quite a few to be had, that they would ultimately lead to a sort of destruction, a demolition of the Republican Party as they had known it. But they were willing to make that trade-off because of the individual gain that it got them. And so, without getting too esoteric here, I think understanding that Trump, of all people, he does not operate through a prism of what's right or what's wrong, of good actors, of bad actors, people who protect freedom versus people who want to attack freedom. Trump lives by the laws of the jungle, right? Only the strongest survive. He understands inherently and understood inherently at the time when he was watching the Republican Party's establishment sort of crumble in real time as the populists were scaling the walls, and as it was becoming clear that the Reagan, H.W. Bush, W. Bush era Republican Party was collapsing, that somebody was going to emerge in that power vacuum and take control. And he was more able and more willing to step into that vacuum and fill it by, I think, essentially challenging anyone to stand up and stop him. And of course, the great irony is that many of the people who came closest or who were once most willing to try to stand up and stop him have, in the years since, become some of his most willing enablers. Ted Cruz, Marco Rubio, the list goes on and on.
Yeah, well, I was going to say also, I mean, I first met Tim, or I remember on Mackinac Island in Michigan when I was covering Mitt Romney, and I sometimes think back to the definition of gaffe in that era. Like, I remember one time Mitt Romney said, "I like sport," instead of "I like sports," and everybody lost their minds, and it just feels positively quaint now. But very briefly back to Anne's point about the Danes, one thing I was struck by when Trump won, I worked at the New York Times, and this wasn't unique to the New York Times, but Trump would do these things, and editors across Washington would be like, well, he must have sent that provocative tweet and done this and done that because he's playing four-dimensional chess, right? They were thinking in the way you think of, like, it's just like McConnell, right? And Schumer, it's this huge, four-dimensional chess, and it's like, no. And I think back, there was an anonymous quote from a Trump advisor in the first term who described it thusly. They said, look, he's not playing checkers, he's just eating the puzzle pieces. And you can, you can do with that what you will, but I think the one through line that I keep in mind that helps me understand the president is he is someone who is always trying to win the minute, the hour, the day, the person directly in front of him. So it can lead to a lot of seeming contradictions, right? Like there were moments in the first term where he would have the Dreamers into the Oval Office, and he was with the Dreamers, and they'd go out and he'd hold a press conference and he would say, you're the best among us. You're valedictorians. You've done nothing wrong. We will staple a green card onto your diplomas, right? But then the sheriffs come in a couple hours later, and he's like, there's some Dreamers we really ought to deport. And it seems like a huge contradiction, but in fact, when he's trying to win over the Dreamers, he understands what that takes. And when he's trying to win over the sheriffs in ICE Border Patrol, he understands what that takes. And the one through line, it'll be interesting in his second term, but when the first term was, when he was pulled between those two competing extremes, he almost always, there would be a backlash from the far right base, and he would retreat to the more hardline position. But I also think it sheds some light on, because people would say, well, look what he said about Jeff. He called him a scumbag or a sleazebag or whatever. Why would he bring him into
both?
Both, okay. To be clear, both.
I just want to claim both.
So it would seem incongruous that he would not only invite Jeff, request his presence in the Oval Office, but while we were there, the president was very oriented, of the three of us in the room, towards Jeff, of trying to win him over and being respectful and kind of wanting you to understand his plan, as he put it, to save humanity. And in that moment, that was very authentic for him.
Right. No, it's... I'll leave my commentary out of this for a moment. No, it was fascinating to watch what your what you noticed. So, everybody up here, my esteemed colleagues, has an expertise. Tim on conservatism and republicanism, Anne on Eastern Europe and autocracy, Ashley on Trump's brain. Tom's expertise is expertise. And the death of expertise. There's even a book by Tom about the very subject. And I'm looking across what's happened over the last 100 days. And one way to understand, one through line that one can identify is an attack on expertise, on knowledge in a kind of way, the dismantling of so many government departments, and I think you all know we're going to have Francis Collins, the former director of the NIH, out here in a few minutes, obviously kind of exhibit A in this phenomenon. But can you talk about that? You picked up on this trend in American life very early. Where does this hostility to the idea of expertise come from, and how, because the Atlantic is pro-expertise, I can ask this question in a kind of biased way. How do we restore in our country the idea that people who worked hard to study a problem actually have more to say than podcasters who are former professional wrestlers?
I don't know how to restore it, so I'm going to talk about the other two things first. I think there are two things going on. One of them links back to what Tim was just talking about why the Republican Party kind of just fell over in the face of all this. And one is that over the past 30 years, especially when you look at what the Republicans once wanted, 30 years ago when I was working on the Hill as a Republican aide, there is a danger to getting everything you've wanted, because then things are not serious anymore. And so you don't have to rely on expertise. What do we want? We want to defeat communism. We want the world basically to be a big free trade zone. We want to have a very high standard of living. We want to have, technological marvels. Well, when you get all that, it seems like all that just happened to most people. And so they say, well, how hard can it be to defeat communism? We did it. How hard can it be to have cheap goods and 4 televisions in your house? Obviously, it's not that hard. And Trump really leaned into that, say, the people who tell you that it's hard are your enemies. They don't like you. Anybody can do it. It's not hard. And that brings me to the second problem about why expertise is under attack. Because if you are an aspiring authoritarian, and I don't think Trump is that sort of has this I think people around him do, but I don't think he has this well-formed idea. But if you are basically trying to stay in power and rule as you wish, experts are your enemies, because expertise by its very definition is non-political. You can't walk into a scientist and say, listen, we're going to need water to boil at a little higher of a temperature today. You're going to have to work on this thing. Snow is going to have to fall when there's no humidity today. We have some plans. You can't do that. Experts say, well, I can't do that for you. I can't agree with you about this. And then you instantly the experts become a problem. They have always been a kind of firebreak against authoritarianism. Because
so when an expert said to Trump, you know what, COVID is actually serious, we have to do something about it, that was offensive in a kind of way.
I need COVID to not be serious. That is politically inconvenient to me. Go back and do it again. And that's true in every authoritarian regime. Every authoritarian regime hates impartial expertise because that can be a block. Because one of the things authoritarians do is tell the masses, we can solve anything. It's easy. We can do stuff. No problem. Trade wars are easy to win. Ukraine, I'll solve it in a day. I mean, it's really, I'm sure Ann feels the same way. It's pretty bitter now to see Trump saying, turns out ending this war is actually harder than I thought. No kidding. No, if only an expert had warned you. What we do about it, to come back to your last part of the question, Jeff, is I don't know. I mean, I erroneously, when I wrote a book about this, said, well, a big disaster is usually when people will come back to expertise. A war, a global depression, maybe even a pandemic. Clearly, my expertise on expertise was limited because I was wrong about that. But I do think there is a certain amount of wisdom that comes from suddenly seeing how difficult things are, from a certain amount of pain or suffering, to say, wow, maybe the people who are telling us how to prevent measles might have a point. Or maybe the people who say the trade wars are bad, the first time you see something jump 10 or 15 or 20%, have a point. But that's a very slow process, because the message, and again, going back to Tim's comments about the Republican Party, the message now coming from the institutional Republican Party is that knowledge is elitist and offensive and basically a way of keeping you down. And it's very hard to come back from that.
Ann?
I was going to say a parallel and similar problem is that the other thing authoritarians don't like, because they're seeking to create their own reality. They're seeking to create an alternative reality in which everything they say is always right and everybody always agrees with them. But a similar problem is the problem of, it's related to the problem of inspectors general and people who are interested in government ethics and all these things that we put into the federal government that we're supposed to check corruption and check waste and check fraud. I mean, every time somebody says waste, fraud, and abuse, we need to get rid of it, forgets that there are multiple levers and institutions and people inside the federal government that we're supposed to do that. And those people are experts of one kind or another. And when you eliminate them, and when, in addition to that, you attack judges and you attack journalists, you attack other people who produce information or produce judgments about government, what you do is you create an absolutely open field for corruption. So when you remove expertise, when you remove checks and balances, when you remove internal procedures, when you say that, when you don't worry anymore about conflicts of interest, when nobody has to fill out those registers you're supposed to fill out before becoming a federal employee, or you fill them out and nobody cares, what you do is you open up the floodgates. And that is another aspect of this administration that I think we're just beginning to get a handle on, which is the degree to which they will use government power to make money for themselves or for their friends or for their family.
Tim, I want to ask you a question about the nature of the Trump base. Tom is making a point that a pandemic that killed more than 1 million people wasn't enough to bring people back to the idea that maybe doctors know something. Actually, it did quite the opposite. And this is not to say, and I'll talk about this with Dr. Collins, not to say that public health authorities didn't make big mistakes along the way, but that's the nature of dealing with a new pandemic. My question is, what would move people who are hardcore MAGA, what would move them away from this movement? Is there anything that would move them away from this movement?
Well, so when you qualify it with hardcore, Jeff, I tend to think that the answer is no, right?
Well, how do you define hardcore?
Well, look, I'm reminded of a story of the two diehard MAGA guys who walk out of a rally chanting the slogans, and they're not looking, and they get hit by a bus, and they go to the pearly gates, and St. Peter says, "Gentlemen, before I let you in, is there anything that you'd like to know?" And the first guy says, "Yeah, actually, St. Peter, now that we're here, you've got to level with us. Did Joe Biden legitimately win the 2020 election?" And St. Peter says, "My friend, I'm sorry to disappoint you, but the answer is yes, he did. He won it fair and square." And the second guy leans over and he says, "This goes even higher than we thought." That's right. So for the diehards, Jeff, I mean, and I've got family like this, I've got friends like this, people I love. I don't know if there's anything that's necessarily going to pry them loose.
What about
from the
a
Trump
serious
grip.
recession?
So, it's interesting. We've seen a lot of data just in the last couple of weeks here that's painting a pretty interesting portrait. For example, even Pew released some numbers the other day, and they were showing that white evangelicals, a group that I've spent a lot of time around, that I wrote a book about recently, that they remain Trump's staunchest bloc of supporters, but their support is down 6 or 7 points over the past 6 or 7 weeks. So this is pretty interesting to watch now. There is erosion across the board, and it's obviously tied to the stock market, to the tariffs, to the trade wars. The question is, I think, there's always been kind of a devil and angel on the shoulder situation inside of the West Wing with Trump and inside of his broader political orbit. You've got people who are willing, a finite number of people who are willing to tell him what he doesn't want to hear and give him advice that's meant to sort of weather these storms. And then you've got a larger group of people who just want to sort of feed his primal instinct for conflict and for chaos and for disruption and for ongoing confrontation with the so-called experts, the elites, etc. And that latter group typically wins out to the degree that the former group gets louder, gets more organized, becomes more emboldened. then you could see a course correction here. But if it continues on this way, you have to assume that this erosion we've been seeing over the last, again, 6 to 8 weeks, that it will continue, and that it will continue into the midterms, and that Trump himself will probably never pay the price for this. But bringing it back full circle, Jeff, the Republican Party, the institutions of conservatism in this country, they're going to pay the price, because there is going to be a long-term political consequence attached to all of this.
Ashley, I want to ask you, thank you, Tim. I want to ask you a question off of what Tim said. It's maybe ultimately a minor moment in a long series of moments, but it goes to this fight between the instinct and this kind of primal instinct for fighting versus something maybe more constructive. Pete Hegseth tweeted this morning, I proudly ended the Women, Peace, and Security program inside the Department of Defense. WPS is yet another woke, divisive, social justice Biden initiative that overburdens our commanders and troops, distracting from our core task, war fighting. WPS is a UN program pushed by feminists and left-wing activist politicians, fawn over it, troops hate it, et cetera, et cetera. Good riddance. The interesting thing about this is that Donald Trump signed WPS into law on April 1st, the beginning of this month. Marco Rubio said at a State Department ceremony, President Trump signed the Women, Peace, and Security Act, a bill that I was very proud to have been a co-sponsor of when I was in the Senate, and it was the first comprehensive law passed in any country in the world. The first law passed by any country anywhere in the world focused on protecting women and promoting their participation in society. So you literally have the Secretary of Defense at the beginning of the month saying, here's a great program that Donald Trump supports. You have Pete Hegseth saying, I'm killing this UN feminist program. Make it make sense. And you have 1 minute.
Well, that's easy.
Okay.
I think it is not quite fair to say that Donald Trump has no coherent political beliefs, because there are a few things going back to the 80s that he does. He has always been very hardline on immigration, and he has always had this view that free trade is bad. He's been pro-tariffs. As he told us in the Oval, he just said, I've believed this for 35 or 40 years, so stipulated. But beyond that, as we talked about before, the only coherence is, again, winning the minute, the hour, the day. And so and again, who knows how Trump will react to this, because as he also told us in the Oval, he had a talk with Hegseth and he thinks he's going to get his act together. So Pete has a little less leverage right now. I have 7 seconds, but he did something in 2017, but now woke is bad. DEI is bad. We're not pro women and feminism.
But it was okay at the beginning of the month, and now it's not good at the end of the month.
How many days is that? That's 30 days, Jeff.
I get your point. Wait, one final question for Anne. This is going to be even harder than the last question to ask Ashley to make it make sense, and you have 30 seconds. You're an expert on this subject. Are we living in an autocracy?
Not yet.
I'll give you 28 more seconds. I'm throwing 28 seconds on the clock.
So we still have plenty of agency. We have opposition political parties.
We can do this.
We have a civil society that functions. We have a press that functions. See, there's at least 5 members of it sitting right here.
Or the highly functional.
We
press,
haven't been arrested yet. What you're watching now, and I don't think this is just Trump. It's actually people around Trump who've learned from what's happened in other places and who are sometimes openly imitating what they've seen in Hungary or Turkey or even Venezuela. You have people around him who understand what are the levers to press on if you want to destroy democracy. So you eliminate the independent civil service. You undermine judges, you undermine experts, as Tom just said. This is a playbook and they are following it, but there is nothing inevitable about politics, and just because they know what the playbook is and they've started to follow it doesn't mean that they achieve their goal in the end, which is making sure we don't ever vote again, or that our vote doesn't mean anything. So, I actually had an argument last night with someone about whether or not there will be midterms. And that will be an important moment, actually. I mean, if there are midterms and if they are successfully and fairly run, then no, we're not an autocracy.
Well, midterms will come after our 7th meeting in here, so we'll find out. Thank you for ending on that uplifting note. I want to thank our great panelists, my great colleagues, for coming, and appreciate you all being here. We'll see you in a minute. Oops.